Her name was Emmeline Carter, and on the day she was meant to become Emmeline Foster, the whole town of Larkspur Hollow gathered to watch her heart break in front of God and everyone she had ever known. The church bell had rung twice already, calling the last stragglers in from the dusty street, and the pews were packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors in their Sunday best, fanning themselves against the late summer heat, whispering behind gloved hands about how lovely the bride looked in her mother's old lace veil. Emmeline stood at the back of the church with her father's arm looped through hers, her heart hammering with something that felt more like dread than joy, though she told herself that was only nerves, that every bride felt this way before she walked the aisle toward the rest of her life. She had loved Thomas Foster since she was 16 years old, had waited through 2 years of his cattle drives and long absences, had written him letters by lamplight and pressed wildflowers into the pages so he would carry a piece of home with him on the trail. She had believed, with the whole foolish certainty of a young heart, that he loved her the same way back. The organ began to play, and the congregation rose, and Emmeline walked down the aisle on her father's arm past faces she had known her whole life, the Hendersons and the Whitfields and old Widow Purdy who had taught her to bake bread, and she smiled at each of them because that was what a bride was supposed to do. Thomas stood waiting at the altar in his good black coat, and for a moment when their eyes met she thought she saw something flicker across his face that she did not want to name, something that looked less like love and more like a man watching a door close on him. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many things that morning, and every one of them turned out to be wrong. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice warm and solemn, moving through the familiar words about love and honor and the sacred bond of marriage, and Emmeline felt her father's hand slip from her arm and settle her hand into Thomas's instead, and she felt the coldness in his fingers before she understood what it meant. When the preacher asked if any man could show just cause why this couple should not be joined, the silence that followed was supposed to last only a breath, a formality, an empty pause before the vows. Instead, Thomas Foster cleared his throat and spoke into that silence himself, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, and what he said was that he could not go through with it, that he had come to the altar meaning to do right by her, but found he could not lie in front of God about a love he no longer felt, that there was another woman, a rancher's daughter from 2 counties over, whom he had been courting in secret these past months, while Emmeline waited faithfully for his letters. He said he was sorry. He said it as though sorry could undo the sight of 200 people turning to stare at the bride left standing alone at the altar in her mother's lace veil, her hand still half extended toward a man who would not take it. The church erupted into a low roar of gasps and murmurs, someone's chair scraped back, a child began to cry, and Emmeline stood frozen in the wreckage of her own wedding, feeling the eyes of the entire town crawl over her like something with claws, waiting to see whether she would faint or weep or run. She did none of those things, though she wanted to do all three. She stood very still, her spine straight the way her mother had taught her, and she looked at Thomas Foster with an expression she would spend years afterward trying to forget, because underneath the humiliation was a grief so total it felt like drowning. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed for long. Within moments he was glancing toward the back of the church, toward the doors, as though eager to be free of the whole affair and ride off toward whatever waited for him on the other side of it. It was in that unbearable silence, with the whole congregation holding its breath to see what would happen next, that a man rose from a pew near the back of the church. Emmeline did not know him well. His name was Caleb Whitmore, a rancher who had come to Larkspur Hollow only the year before, a widower who kept mostly to himself and his cattle and the small herd of horses. He was slowly building into a respectable operation on the edge of town. She had spoken to him perhaps a handful of times, at the mercantile, at a barn raising, always polite exchanges about weather and crops, nothing more. She had no reason to expect him to do what he did next. Caleb walked down the aisle, his boots loud against the wooden floor in the ringing silence, and he did not look at Thomas Foster at all, as though the man had already ceased to matter. He stopped in front of Emmeline and removed his hat, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, but it carried, steady and sure in a way that cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through fog. He said that he did not know if it was his place to speak, but that he could not sit and watch a good woman be shamed in front of the whole town for another man's cowardice, and that if she would have him, he would be honored to marry her that very day, right there at the altar, so that she would not have to walk back down that aisle alone with every eye in Larkspur Hollow following her in pity. The church went utterly silent. Emmeline stared at him, this quiet rancher she barely knew, and for a moment she could not make sense of what he was offering, could not tell if it was kindness or madness or some strange mixture of both. Her first instinct was to refuse, to flee the church and lock herself in her room and never come out again. But something in his eyes held her there, a steadiness that asked nothing of her except permission to help, and she found herself thinking of her father's disappointed face, of Widow Purdy's pitying eyes, of the long walk home she would have to make either way, humiliated either as an abandoned bride or as a woman married in scandal to a man she barely knew. She asked him, in a voice too low for anyone but him and the preacher to hear, why he would do such a thing for a stranger. Caleb answered that she was not entirely a stranger to him, that he had watched her these past months tending her father's garden and reading to the school children on Sunday afternoons and sitting with old Widow Purdy when her rheumatism was bad, and that he had thought more than once that Thomas Foster was a fool who did not deserve her, though he had never imagined he would be given the chance to say so out loud. He told her plainly that he was not offering out of pity, and that if she wished to refuse him she should do so without a second thought, and he would escort her out of the church himself and let the gossips talk about him instead of her. It was that last part, she would later say, that decided her, the offer to take the town's judgment onto his own shoulders and carry it away from her. She looked once more at Thomas Foster, who stood by the side door with his hat already in his hand, not even waiting to see what she would choose, and something in her chest that had been breaking all morning hardened instead into resolve. She turned to Caleb Whitmore and said that she would. What followed was a wedding unlike any Larkspur Hollow had ever witnessed, a ceremony performed in the wreckage of another, with the same flowers still wilting in their vases and the same stunned congregation now murmuring not in scorn but in astonishment. The preacher, flustered but willing, asked if there was objection to this joining, and this time no one spoke, though Emmeline could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes upon her, some sympathetic, some scandalized, all of them certain they had just witnessed the strangest thing to happen in the town's history. She and Caleb spoke their vows to each other as near strangers, his hand steady around hers, his voice low and sure, and when the preacher pronounced them married, the church broke into a stunned and scattered applause that felt less like celebration and more like disbelief finding somewhere to go. Emmeline walked back down the aisle on her new husband's arm, her mother's veil still pinned in her hair, her heart a strange tangle of grief and gratitude and terror at what she had just done. The days that followed were not easy ones. The town of Larkspur Hollow talked of little else for weeks, and Emmeline found herself the subject of every wagging tongue at the mercantile and every knowing glance after church, some pitying her as a woman too proud to walk home alone, others whispering that she had schemed the whole thing, that she and Caleb Whitmore had planned it together to shame Thomas Foster before he could shame her first. None of it was true, but truth mattered little against the appetite of a small town for scandal, and Emmeline bore the weight of it with a straight back and a closed mouth, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. She moved out to Caleb's ranch on the edge of town, into a modest but well-built house with a porch that faced the mountains, and she found herself living side by side with a man she had married in an act of desperate pride and had yet to truly come to know. Their first weeks together were awkward and careful, two people circling each other in the aftermath of a decision made in a single desperate moment, unsure how much of it had been real and how much had simply been the panic of the day. Caleb was not a talkative man, but he was a steady one, and Emmeline began to notice the small kindnesses he offered without ever asking for thanks. The way he mended the fence around her garden before she had even mentioned it needed mending, the way he brought her wildflowers from the far pasture without comment, setting them in a jar on the windowsill and saying nothing about it, as though it embarrassed him to be caught in an act of tenderness. She learned that he had lost his first wife 2 years before to a fever that swept through the county, and that he had buried his grief in work the way some men buried it in whiskey, building his ranch up from almost nothing because it gave his hands something to do while his heart healed. She learned that he had watched her, as he'd said in the church, for longer than she realized, that he had noticed the quiet decency in the small things she did for others, the patience she showed the school children, the gentleness in the way she cared for the old and the sick, and that he had admired her from a careful distance long before Thomas Foster's cowardice ever gave him a reason to step forward and say so. Slowly, in the way that trust grows between two people willing to be patient with each other, something shifted between them. Emmeline found herself watching for Caleb's return each evening, listening for his horse on the road, feeling a small unfamiliar warmth in her chest when she saw him. She found herself laughing at his dry, quiet humor, the jokes he made almost under his breath as though testing whether she was paying attention. She found, to her own surprise, that the grief and humiliation of her wedding day had begun to fade into something distant, replaced by a life that felt more solid and more honest than the one she had imagined with Thomas Foster, a life built not on girlhood promises but on the daily proof of a man who showed up, who worked hard, who treated her with a respect that asked nothing in return. There were still hard days. There was still the sting of a neighbor's sideways glance, the memory of standing alone at that altar that would visit her sometimes in the quiet hours before sleep, the fear that she had simply traded one kind of hurt for a slower, quieter kind. But there was also, increasingly, the sense that she had been given an unlikely gift in the wreckage of that terrible morning, and that the gift was standing beside her, mending fences and bringing wildflowers and asking nothing of her but the chance to prove himself worthy of the choice she'd made. The true test of what they had built came nearly a year later, when Thomas Foster returned to Larkspur Hollow. His engagement to the rancher's daughter from the neighboring county had collapsed, it was said, when her family discovered the manner in which he had abandoned his first bride at the altar and judged him unfit to be trusted with their own daughter's future. He came back to town with his tail between his legs, his pride in tatters, and whether from genuine regret or simple loneliness, he sought Emmeline out at the mercantile one autumn afternoon, catching her alone while Caleb was out at the far pasture. He told her he had made a terrible mistake, that he had thought of her every day since he'd left her standing at that altar, that he believed now he had let his fear of settling down blind him to the woman who had loved him faithfully for years. He asked, with what Emmeline could only describe afterward as breathtaking gall, whether there might be some way to undo what had been done, whether she might still hold some feeling for him beneath the marriage she had entered in haste and humiliation. Emmeline stood in the mercantile with the autumn light slanting through the windows and looked at the man she had once believed she would spend her whole life loving, and she felt, to her own quiet astonishment, almost nothing at all. Where there had once been a girl's whole heart, there was now only a distant, faded ache, like a scar that no longer pained her but simply reminded her of a wound long since healed. She told him plainly that what he was asking was impossible, not because of some abstract notion of duty or vows spoken under duress, but because she had come, in the year since that terrible morning, to love her husband, truly love him, not as a consolation or a convenience but as the center of the life she had built with her own two hands. She told Thomas that he had done her the strange and backward favor of setting her free from a future that would have made her small, and that she would not trade the steady, honest love she had found for the fragile, uncertain one he was offering now that it suited him again. She left him standing in the mercantile with his hat in his hands, and walked home along the familiar road to the ranch, and she found that her steps grew lighter the closer she came to the house with its porch facing the mountains. She told Caleb about the encounter that evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sun go down behind the ridge, and she watched something tighten in his jaw at the mention of Thomas Foster's name before it eased again as she told him what she had said. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when he was working up to saying something that mattered to him, and then he told her, in the plain unadorned way he said all the things that mattered most, that he had married her that day in the church because he could not bear to see her humiliated, but that somewhere in the years since, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, he had fallen in love with her for her own sake, entirely apart from the circumstances that had first brought them together. He said he had been afraid to tell her, afraid that she still carried some part of her heart toward the life she had lost that morning at the altar, and that hearing her turn Thomas Foster away had given him the courage to finally say what he had been carrying for months. Emmeline reached for his hand there on the porch, feeling the same steadiness in his fingers that she had felt on the worst day of her life, and told him that she loved him too, fully and without reservation, that the humiliation of that terrible morning had led her, against every expectation, to the truest happiness she had ever known. They stayed married on that ranch at the edge of Larkspur Hollow for the rest of their days, and in time the scandal of that wedding day faded into one of the town's favorite stories, told and retold at gatherings and quilting bees, the tale of the bride abandoned at the altar and the quiet rancher who stood up in front of the whole congregation and offered her his hand. The children they eventually raised together grew up hearing the story as a kind of family legend, proof, their mother would tell them, that the worst days of a person's life did not always stay the worst, that sometimes the very humiliation meant to break you could crack open a door to something far better than you had ever dared to hope for. Emmeline Whitmore, who had once stood frozen and abandoned before the eyes of an entire town, became known in later years as one of the most respected women in the county. Her marriage held up as an example of the kind of steady, hard-won love that outlasted every early storm. And on quiet evenings, when she and Caleb sat together on that same porch where he had first told her he loved her, she would sometimes think back to that terrible morning at the church and feel, instead of shame, a strange and grateful wonder at the way one man's cruelty had made room for another man's quiet courage, and how that courage had built her a life more solid and more loving than the one she had lost.